Well, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Thank you to all the presenters for some, I think, groundbreaking research on this particular moment in time, remarkably rich and varied. It'll make a wonderful exhibition, I have no doubt, and book, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. So my remarks are going to be a bit free form here. I think we've heard enough prepared papers, so I just take this job of being the broom of the system as best I can and make a series of points here. Maybe more so yesterday than today, I think some of us were struck by a kind of disjunctiveness, both of the actual experiences that were being described in different settings, and also a certain kind of either parochial or narrow perspective on the subject, which I understand very well is a kind of artifact of a conference format like this one. And yet I think my comments will segue very well from Jeffrey Diefendorf's with respect to both the need for a diachronic as well as synchronic perspective, and also a need for some kind of overview and a comparative lens. So I want to maybe set out a series of larger questions that we can reflect on, and a number of them already touched in various of the discussions. So to begin with, again, to emphasize this issue of periodization, how do we delimit this period if it's a good thing to delimit it? Only as a matter of heuristics. When is it most useful to say it begins and ends? To what extent shall we see this war as a moment of exception and emergency? And to what extent, to use famous formulation of Clausewitz, shall we see it as a continuation of politics by other means? Not just politics, but other things too. So this problem of continuity and discontinuity, which has come up several times here, is quite important, I think, and asks us to think about what is it that is specifically new and unprecedented during and coming out of this war. Jeffrey, I think you also, in your introduction to the session, also touched on this idea of accelerating or decelerating certain existing processes, and I think we have seen that in a number of instances, and I'll kind of elaborate that a little bit more. Certainly there are some genuinely new experiences that come out of this. The atom bomb, for one, the revelation of the death camps, for another. Then there are certain other things that, as just said, are kind of sped up or slowed down by this war. For example, suburbanization, which is going to happen right after the war, as we know. We can now sense the extent to which the whole discourse on decentralization that is a result of fears that come out of aerial bombardment in particular push the discourse of decentralization into the post-war period. Not that the decentralized urbanism hasn't been proposed from early in the century, but it now has a new meaning shaped by the war. So we can see again the war as again a kind of accelerator, a catalyst of certain processes that are germinating. I think we also can separate out or start to try to distinguish between short-term and long-term effects of the war, even delayed effects of the war. And let me give you one example, which isn't of a specifically architectural nature, but it might have some architectural implications. The role of women, not touched on at all in these last 2 days. We know that during World War II, women go into the war effort in major numbers. The Rosie the Riveters, in the munitions factories, the ambulance drivers, and so forth, providing a new experience of emancipation, cosmopolitanism, and so forth. We also know that in the 1950s, these same women, in many contexts, not in all countries, and we really have to nuance what we say depending on context, but certainly in many, women are going to be forced right back into the house by a more conservative, traditionalist period, and what we can then say, apropos of what's going to happen in the 1960s, is that this delay, if you like, works as a kind of pressure cooker, producing the explosion that is the second wave of feminism in the 60s. So in that sense, I think we have to think about the temporality or the time frame within which effects are going to be felt from these various causative factors that come out of the war. Very, very much related to this, and already just suggested, the unevenness of various kinds of experiences. I mean, how can we indeed compare a situation in a place like Poland or Czechoslovakia with that in the United States, or indeed Japan? And here we get into very complicated areas that have not only to do with different historical experiences during and prior to the war, but also of cultural differences too. And I think certainly when we're talking about Japan, as we've just been doing, we sense, I mean, as uncomfortable sometimes it is to talk about national character, cultural difference, we have to acknowledge these factors that are changing the experience from place to place. We can ask whether a distinction between, say, reconstruction and planning is a useful one. It was interesting to see the shift in one of the East European countries from a periodical called Building to one called Rebuilding. You know, it becomes, it happens at a certain moment during the war, but of course, planning is the name of the game in the United States for sure, because there's no reconstruction that has to be done. And in Europe, and Japan, or let's leave Japan out, and I don't feel as well equipped to talk about Japan anyway, but Europe certainly has other things on its mind. And the difference between planning and reconstruction is not just doing those two things, but it also has to do with difference in orientation, in one case toward the future, in another case toward the past. And these kind of future directedness versus a past directedness at this moment, I think are very significant in terms of how architects and other agents of our built environment are operating at these moments. Certainly it's interesting to realize, and here Japan seems to be, you know, a very fascinating exception, how many memorials and war cemeteries are being built actually during the war. I mean, they're not even waiting until the war is over. Of course, you have a need for cemeteries immediately. And in that sense, one can compare World War II to World War I in interesting ways, something I'm going to get to in a second. But I think we also see the necessity, the absolute necessity of a really microscopic kind of chronology, the differences between 1939, 1942, 1943, 1945 in different places. Airways to Peace, the exhibition at MoMA in '43, could only have been in '43. That's the moment. That's the moment when it becomes clear that the Allies are going to win the war. And Road to Victory, which took place the year before, was all about winning a war. Airways to Peace is about trying to envision a post-war international world. And from that standpoint, I don't think that Alfred Barr's letter to Herbert Bayer telling him, we're not just interested in cartography here and ways of, aeriovisual technologies, but we're also interested in representing international cooperation and peace. I don't think this is trivial, this letter. I think it's essential. Wendell Willkie's, statement, there are no distant points in the world anymore, is more than, a cartographic issue. It's a political one. And now, so this leads to some comments on the role of symbolic representation during wartime. And I have to say that when I sat down to put together my book on the post-war period, almost 20 years ago now, an anthology of written documents related to post-war architecture culture, my initial impulse was to start in 1945. And ultimately, I chose 1943 to 1968 as my brackets. And 1943, not only because it made a neat quarter century with the rhetorical year 68, but also, as I just said, because 43 was a turning point of the war. It was a hinge point. After victories in North Africa and Sicily and Stalingrad, this was the moment when the future was on the agenda rather than the present and the past, at least certainly in the United States. And here I have to thank my friend and colleague Ken Frampton for drawing my attention to the importance of Jose Luis Sert, Fernand Léger, and Siegfried Gideon's 9 Points on Monumentality. The importance of that document, written in 1943, although unpublished until the 50s, actually, by Gideon. This document could only have been written by 3 Europeans sitting out the war years in the United States, agonized about their homelands and the destruction they were undergoing, at the same time sensing this overwhelming power and plenitude of this younger nation, which is just stepping up to its own triumphalist role in the so-called American century. And so their call for not just monumentality, but very specifically, very emphatically, a new monumentality, not the pseudo-bombastic monumentality, but a new monumentality that could somehow express the emotional and symbolic passion of the day is absolutely critical, I think, to understanding that this time and how this document gets formulated, and why monumentality at this moment of 43. We've also there have been some comments by, I think, Jean-Louis and Hartmut Frank about the importance of biography here, of personal experience and of networks that exist, generational networks in some cases. And by the way, I think apropos of periodization, we have to think about a generational model of periodizing in relation to the synchronic wartime brackets that are being proposed by this conference, and see how they overlay exactly. But apropos of this kind of personal relationships that exist within the culture of architecture, the various statuses of people, of architects at this moment: exile, refugee, enemy alien, internal exile, collaborator, xenophobic patriot. Robert Moses, calling people like Gropius and would include all, Martin Wagner and all the emigres who've entered the United States and been welcomed in the 30s, calling them long-haired planners, utopian socialist types, that are not true, that are not American enough. I mean, I think these things are crucial to kind of understand the different force fields that are at play, and how these constitute formative experiences, friendships, also guilt that's coming out of this war. And we haven't had much to say about that at all. Apropos of some of yesterday's discussions, I brought with me today a book that was written in 1942. It's an architectural autobiography written by William Lescaz with the existential title On Being an Architect. Here we have a Swiss who comes to the United States in the 20s, is responsible in collaboration with George Howe for one of the iconic buildings of modern architecture, the PSFS building in Philadelphia, doing a lot of work in the 30s. Suddenly during the war years, sidelined, no work, nothing to do. So let me just give you a taste of how he's thinking. The book is interesting. It's addressed, part one is addressed to the layman, and part two is addressed to the architect. But in any case, it starts with a little introduction that says, today we are fighting to save our lives, our homes. Beyond this, we are fighting also the never-ending battle to create better lives, better homes, a better world. In the face of destruction, we dare to think of construction. Thus, we continue to dream of planning, order, architecture, life. And then in this kind of part two, which is directed to architects, I just want to tell you how he starts that one. He says, this is called War and Building. At the present moment, a great number of architects aged plus or minus 40 are made to feel that their usefulness to their country is less than that of an 18-year-old apprentice in a flying school. That doesn't make sense. It's waste today, and it may become disastrous tomorrow due to the fact that building is the first operation in the production of munitions, a fact which is being forcibly imposed upon us. Building is a war tool too, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point is that their architects at this moment have to reinvent the profession. And what we're seeing is a major transformation in the direction that we've heard from so many people about, of a more technocratic, rationalized institution, rather than the gentleman tastemaker of the previous period. So the architects, really desiring desperately to be of service, in some cases out of very sincere patriotism and belief in the war effort, but not knowing quite what to do. I think the first paper yesterday, Anna's, was valuable in telling us about what architects do in order to make themselves as useful as engineers at this moment, as useful as the kind of big scale Albert Kahn-like firms, getting themselves out of the atelier and into a more corporately structured firm, or a collaboration of some kind, how to work for the government. At least that's part of the story in this country. Certainly scale shifts are part of the issue. I'll come back to that in another context in a moment. Again, touched on by several people, but not sufficiently elaborated, I think, the differences between the First World War and the Second. World War I was horrible, but it was nowhere near as destructive as World War II. World War I had 8 million victims. World War II had 32 million. Poland lost more than 20% of its population, many Jews, as we know. Yugoslavia lost 10%. Soviet losses were between 20 and 30 million. Germany more than 5 million. Japan 3 million. Material losses were much greater too, especially, and we've heard variously about this, in countries like Poland, Russia, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, northern France, Belgium, Holland, and at the end of the war in Germany. Not just the Germans, but also the Russians followed a scorched earth policy at the end of the war. Massive air raids on cities like Coventry, Rotterdam, Dresden, and Le Havre wreaked incredible havoc that I think maybe, you know, contemporary generation has a hard time fathoming unless they come from a portion of the world today where such things are going on. This experience, this formative experience, cannot be underestimated, especially as we now move on to try to understand the post-war period. Visitors had a sense of unreality of walking through these kind of bomb craters, heaps of rubble, stinking ruins. In Germany, 1/4 of the housing stock was uninhabitable after the war. In Dusseldorf alone, 93% of houses were thought to be uninhabitable. Mobility, major theme of the post-war period. Architects like to associate mobility with things like automobile culture, the interstate highway system, elevated urban viaducts, high-tech walking cities. Mobility has another meaning too. During World War II, 40 or 50 million people were expelled from their homes and made refugees. It was the greatest migration of peoples Europe had ever known, had known in 1,500 years. Returning prisoners of war, 6 million displaced people in Germany alone, internal migrations. Even in the physically unscathed United States, major disruptions caused by migrating wartime workers, then returning GIs. And might bring to the next issue, and these are not necessarily in order, the Cold War. Hardly been mentioned in the last 2 days, although maybe slightly touched on in the Burov presentation we just heard. When does the Cold War begin? Okay, so conventional wisdom has it begins right after the hot war ends. Churchill makes his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri. An iron curtain has descended on the world from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. More recently, revisionist historians have been arguing that the Cold War actually begins much earlier, at least as early as 1917, because of what the Cold War is about is a battle over ideology, of capitalist ideology versus communist, understood to be natural enemies, ontological enemies. History, that history must be easily traceable from the Bolshevik Revolution. And so viewed that way, viewed in this lens, how does it change our understanding of World War II? A frivolous thought, if Hitler had won the war, the Cold War probably would have been over in the 1940s rather than lasted through the 20th century. Maybe still continuing. But of course, this brings us to the very big issue here, which is the relationship between geopolitics and ideology, if we see that as a kind of crude distinction between a hot and a cold war. Of course, here again, we have to be very careful, and as we've seen in many of the presentations, these cannot be separated easily, although sometimes it's useful for us to try to tease these different strands out. Certainly, questions of shifting borders, boundaries, the kind of dislocations we were just talking about, are geopolitical problems, but not only. They get infused with ideology, as we know from the research that Jean-Louis and Hartmut have done on Alsace-Lorraine. The paper on concentration camps on the Eastern Front, I think, demonstrated beautifully that the imbrication of economics and ideology. So did the paper on Nazi bridge building, how aesthetics get bound up with economic issues. We've also seen how infrastructure sometimes seems, well, the first session was seemingly about infrastructure, how quickly it morphs into superstructure issues. Civil defense has to be understood both as a new technological approach to keeping people safe from bombardment, but also as an ideological program. And whether we're talking about Gordon Colin's, charming renderings of bomb shelters, or keeping architects and artists busy doing camouflage work, I think we really have to look at this with some healthy skepticism. During the Cold War, of course, it's remarkable how long people clung to the idea that stockpile of cinder blocks and soup cans would preserve them from nuclear holocaust. The need on the part of people to believe in these palliatives in the face of frightening realities, and of governments to try to calm and rally their citizens through such civic initiatives can't be underestimated. Victory gardens are not just, don't exist only in Italy, but all over the place, including the United States, where we could say, if an early instance of locavores, or maybe today we're late autarkists or something. But in any case, the Victory Garden is an act of patriotism. It's not just a subsistence thing. Also the real need, the desperate need of people to hide and escape from destruction, but also not to forget the propagandistic dimension of all this. Likewise, that of other slogans and buzzwords, the discourse of flexibility, the rhetoric of democracy and freedom, the post-war house. Again, we have to understand these in the context also of hegemonic efforts to shape and desublimate disturbing realities, and to cheer up people who are suffering, if not hardly, barely surviving. Flexibility is going to be one of the great sales pitches for prefabrication right after the war. Again, prefabrication or flexibility should be understood not just as a kind of technological thing, but also as a way of assuring people that their lives are not about to be totally controlled and regimented and standardized. And this is a big issue in the United States. And the whole story of the rise and fall of prefabrication after the war is essential to understand in this context. Kit of parts sounds good. Standardized diversity may be, just as true a way of describing what we're getting. Levittown has to be understood, I think, as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Here we have a highly technologically advanced method of producing houses, cloaked in the nostalgic garb of the Cape Cottage, right? It's acceptable because it looks familiar, even though structurally it's certainly not. And this brings me to the whole issue of desire, fantasies, repressed ones during the war, the whole reception end of things. We've heard a lot about production. We could call this the function of the future in the context of the wartime ideology. Consumerism, to give it its ideological name, as we know, is essential after the war as a way to kind of keep the economic engine running as one planner in Washington, D.C. put it, mobilize for abundance, right? To convert Fortress America to peacetime production. And with all that rhetoric, and don't forget, of course, that the Cold War is also going to provide an engine for continuing military production too. So when we talk about kind of a shift from production to consumption, or from a military to a peacetime economy, the military economy is going to continue to chug along very well. With the addition of the consumer economy, advertising. This is very important to understand that advertising, at least in the United States, is the one sphere of life that isn't curtailed during the war, because the government understands how, the one sphere of normal life that isn't, where everything, material shortages, all kinds of stuff, advertising goes forward because government understands the importance of whetting people's appetite for what's to come, and also giving them something optimistic to look forward to. At the same time, and we can't underestimate this, the effects on people of the experience of scarcity, of privation, of rationing. Candy continues to be rationed in Britain until the 1950s, early 50s, has the effect of making people long for things. The kind of backlash against standardization and systematization, and also against makeshift, temporary, chicken coop-like living quarters is something, again, that's going to make, the Dymaxion house and other kind of prefabricated dreams look not very inviting after a kind of initial moment of enthusiasm right after the war. By the way, Russell Lines, in his book, The Tastemakers, does a very beautiful job, I think, of characterizing what he calls the shift to modern. I mean, how this kind of sea change in taste that takes place, very much driven by the experience of kind of rationalization and winning the war, at the same time as kind of backsliding from that, because people are really sick and tired of the war also by the time it's over. Other kinds of backlash, more profound in the European context, which are experienced with things like returns to regionalism. The 30s have already seen a kind of regionalist correction to the internationalism of the 20s, but this continues and becomes even more profound and pronounced right after the war. Why? Because people are sad about their homeland, because the connection to the soil is experienced at an emotional level that they haven't felt it before in the context of all the destruction around them. So the problems of regionalism versus nationalism, or the problem of identity after the war, and if not national identity, as some kind of autochthonous identity. Poetics coming back in. The young Otto van Eyck appearing, at Siam's first post-war meeting and calling for an infusion of poetry and imagination into architecture. Again, this kind of moment, this emotional moment, which is also part of the 9 points on monumentality, this desire for some kind of symbolic representation that is commensurate with this moment, again, shouldn't be underestimated. Ethical questions that are filter back in. In the paper on Greece we saw yesterday, Doxiadis, interested in this kind of ethnographic documentation, that kind of framed in a sort of, science of collecting information. In fact, but those kinds of operations of sending cadres of, again, unemployed architects or social scientists out into the regions, out into the rural areas to document artifacts of everyday life and make drawings of farmhouses and things like that, are part of this period. In France, this is where the young Henri Lefebvre is employed for some years on these what are they called? They're scaffolds. Chantier, yes, exactly. Okay, so this brings me, I guess, to one of the last points I want to make concerning this business of modernity and modernism. Probably many of you have seen Roberto Rossellini's film, Germany, Year Zero. Date is 1948, 47, 48. It's the first film to be made on location in Germany after the war. What you probably remember, if you've seen it, as very vivid images in the opening sequence on this bleached out film stock, which is the only stock that was available, of, again, bombed out Berlin, these piles of rubble and so forth, with this kind of grating and portentous soundtrack accompaniment. And maybe also the scene in the destroyed Reichschancellery of Speer, where this old Nazi is trying to sell bootleg tape of one of Hitler's speeches to American soldiers who want to take it home as a tourist souvenir. But I want to draw your attention, just for symbolic reasons, to the plot of this film, which is actually a family drama, in which there's an old and a very sick father who is of the generation of World War I and represents its values. Then there is a son and daughter, both of whom are in their 20s. The son has fought in the German army and is right now hiding out in this cramped communal apartment that many families are living not so harmoniously in, scared that there are going to be reprisals against him by the occupying forces. And the sister who is selling things on the black market just to scrape by, and possibly even selling sex. And then there's the younger brother, who's 12 years old, and he is sort of the protagonist of this, who is innocent of all this, doesn't really understand what's going on, but somehow has the sense that it's up to him to make things all right, make them better, alleviate the pain within this household. And what happens, of course, is that in an act of what he thinks is a mercy killing, he ends up murdering his father, and then he himself commits suicide by jumping from a skeleton of one of these buildings. And the people that are left at the end of all this are the older brother and sister, the two that have been through the war, that have compromised. Speaking of compromises, a little while ago, this middle generation of survivors, some sisters, survivors, the ones that have pragmatically gone along with the world in order to get through somehow. And the last shot in the film is of a train moving off into the distance in some unknown future. Well, the point is, Le Corbusier described the post-war period as the epoch of realities, as opposed to the pioneer years of the 20s. And I think what we can sense in this new dawning period that the war brings is this kind of reality check, but also the realization of things that we're still in the realm of, if not utopia, still of very small production earlier on. I mean, modern architecture, for all of this, the marvelous reconstruction we can do, existed, but not at the scale, not anywhere near the scope it's about to exist. I like to draw a distinction between the so-called international style, this term coined by Johnson and Hitchcock when they brought European modern movement to the United States in 1932 and showed it repackaged for American consumption in the Museum of Modern Art, and the post-war international style, that which is going to be exported back to Europe after the war. So something that was a European import in the early 30s, after the war, will become an American export, which of course ushers in these new very important paradigms like Americanization, not entirely new. I mean, we know that America has been exporting things for much of the 20th century, and yet not with the kind of intensity and again, scope of what's to come here. And policy of exportation in the context of this new American century. Americanization slash globalization, and so we need to think through these two terms in relation to one another. The world during World War II is not quite global yet, in the way, certainly not in the way we understand it today, and as also evidenced by the places that we have considered today, because there's a whole huge part of the world that's been completely left out of the picture, that's demapped as of this point, which is going to become increasingly mapped. Except for a few passing references to the colonies in Africa, in Asia, wherever they are, the whole trajectory of decolonization, which is about to unfold, is just sort of waiting to happen. And one, it's interesting to think about the World War II moment in relation to that, the air view, which has the world in its sights, but hasn't quite colonized the global village just yet. These effects of uneven development, of cultural lags and so forth that are going to start, things are going to start shifting around. I mean, all this kind of waiting in suspense during this kind of hinge point of history of World War II. Finally, my very last point, I promise. Going back to a comment that was made, I think, in the very first session by somebody in the audience who was from Russia. And this has to do with what I would call a kind of post-humanist positivism today. We all know that architecture is a technocratic profession, and all the more so, indeed, since World War II brought the trajectory of modernization to this kind of violent pitch, fulfilling Max Weber's vision of a kind of administrative bureaucracy and rationalization intensively. But history, or I should say historiography, the practice of writing history, has other obligations. And so I guess this is just a cautionary note to end on, against a kind of post-humanist positivism in favor of historiography. Thank you.
Wonderful. Many thanks, John. You've pointed to many of the exciting issues which have been brought up, many of the inadequacies, of course. The world, as I said initially, is a total social fact, and it's tempting to both to try to expand it geographically. The colonies were not there, but we know that colonial troops were also among the victims and the actors of the war theater. We know that countries as far away from the front as Brazil were engaged when certain Wiener planned their Cidade dos Motores within the American war effort. We've also caught with you, Jeffrey, the importance of seeing in this crystal of time in which everything is so fast, the impact of long trajectories, biographies which had started decades before, patterns of modernization which are started and will be boosted by what happens. So, of course, the diachrony is in the synchrony, yet we have not exhausted all the elements of a synchrony. So again, thank you to all the speakers, all the moderators, to your brilliant conclusions. Thanks to the staff of the Institute of Fine Arts, to Anna, who played all the roles in this conference, including delivering a remarkable and very moving paper this morning, to Susanna, who handled the registration, to the CCA and to Princeton. I don't need to repeat myself. The next step, we should always leave with a sort of dash of optimism, is at least for all these papers to be put with the permission of the speakers online on the new site of the CCA. So we're first aiming at an electronic publication, and if we find a publisher in this dire context, maybe on paper. And then the next step will be dealing in a different manner, probably in a more personal one, with all these issues, an exhibition in the fall of 2010. Thanks very much, and again, I think it was a very interesting and innovative moment, and one which will be followed by others, I hope. Thank you.